This happened about 6 years ago. I had always enjoyed walking, not just for the exercise, but for the solitude it offered. Every day, I'd set out from my house, navigating through town on a well-worn route. My usual habit was to start around midday, sometimes as early as 11 a.m. or as late as 2 p.m. I liked to be home before the sun dipped too low, before the world changed into something less familiar. But that day was different. I had been swamped with errands and couldn't get out for my walk until almost 3 p.m. I debated skipping it altogether. Something about the lateness of the hour unsettled me, though I couldn't quite place why. But I'm not one to let unease dictate my actions, so I shrugged it off and decided to go. Just a short walk, I told myself. Back before the cold sets in. The streets were quieter than usual as I left the house. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, and the air carried an edge of evening chill. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts wander with the rhythm of my steps. By the time I checked my phone, it was nearly 6 p.m. I was 6 miles from home, further than I intended to go. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint orange haze. Darkness was creeping in, and with it, the kind of cold that claws its way through even the thickest layers of clothing. I quickened my pace, eager to get home. When I was about 2 miles from my house, I passed a convenience store. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on the ground against the side of the building, smoking a cigarette. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed entirely in black, a hoodie, pants, and shoes. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes fixed on me with a vacant stare that sent a shiver down my spine. I forced myself to ignore him and kept walking, but something made me glance back a few moments later. He was standing now, moving in the same direction as me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Coincidence. Paranoia. But every time I checked over my shoulder, he was still there. Still following. A sick feeling churned in my stomach as I heard him shout, "Hey!" His voice was sharp, grating, and it echoed unnaturally in the still night air. I ignored him, but he shouted again. "Hey! What the fuck?" This time, his tone was angry, almost accusing. My heart pounded as I quickened my steps, refusing to look back. I texted my dad, my fingers trembling as I explained what was happening. "Some guy's following me," I wrote. "He's yelling at me." His response came quickly, "How far are you?" "Less than a mile," I replied. "Keep walking," he said. "I'll come get you. Just don't stop." I glanced behind me again. The man was still there, his pace matching mine. I was 3/4 of a mile from my street when a terrible thought crossed my mind: if I turned down my road, he'd know where I lived. That couldn't happen. I texted my dad again. "I'm not turning down my street. I'll keep going. Meet me further ahead." He replied with a simple okay. Then I heard it. A frantic noise, like the sound of someone's feet slapping against the pavement. I turned my head, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. The man had pulled up his hood and was sprinting toward me. His movements were erratic, almost animalistic, and his shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. Panic took over. I bolted, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. My lungs burned with every breath, but I didn't dare slow down. I darted across the street, weaving between parked cars and darkened alleyways, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us. Finally, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms wildly, praying the driver would stop. The car slowed, and relief washed over me as I recognized it. It was my dad. I yanked open the door and threw myself inside, barely able to get the words out as I tried to explain what had happened. My dad's face darkened as he listened. "Stay in the car," he said, his voice calm but cold. He turned the car around and began driving back the way I had come, scanning the streets for any sign of the man. But he was gone. The sidewalks were empty, the shadows undisturbed. Since that night, I changed my habits. I don't walk after 2 p.m. anymore, and I always carry a knife for protection. But even now, years later, I can't help but wonder, what would he have done if he had caught me? And why did he disappear so completely, as if he had never been there at all? After that night, the darkness seemed to hold a new kind of weight. I became hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound, and every unfamiliar face I encountered. My dad, always the pragmatic one, suggested that we install cameras around the house. Within a week, our property was dotted with security devices, their red lights blinking like tiny sentinels in the night. But safety measures couldn't erase the memories. I kept replaying the man's vacant stare in my mind, the way his movements seemed too deliberate, too unnatural. Who was he? Why had he chosen to follow me that night? The questions gnawed at me, but the answers remained elusive. For weeks, I avoided walking altogether. My daily routines were reduced to errands and commutes, always by car, always with a sense of hurried caution. My dad's words from that night stayed with me, just don't stop. It had become a mantra of sorts, a reminder to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the fear felt. Then, one afternoon, I decided it was time to reclaim my walks. It had been nearly a month since the incident, and I told myself I couldn't let one night one man steal something I loved. Armed with my pocket knife and a healthy dose of vigilance, I set out on a short route close to home. It was broad daylight, the sun high in the sky, and the streets were bustling with life. Kids played on sidewalks, neighbors tended to their yards, and joggers passed by with cheerful nods. It felt almost normal. Almost. But as I turned a corner, I felt it again, that nagging sensation of being watched. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced over my shoulder. A man in a gray hoodie stood at the far end of the street, leaning against a lamppost. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything that would seem outwardly threatening. Yet, his presence sent a ripple of unease through me. Was it him? It was hard to tell from this distance, but something about his stance, his stillness, felt familiar. I quickened my pace, clutching the knife in my pocket. The short blade suddenly felt inadequate, but it was all I had. As I rounded another corner, I dared to look back again. The man was gone. Relief flooded me, but it was fleeting. The paranoia had taken root, and every pedestrian I passed felt like a potential threat. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath shaky. My dad noticed immediately. "What happened?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Nothing," I lied. "Just a weird feeling, that's all." He didn't press me, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch and shift, and every creak of the house felt amplified. I kept the knife under my pillow, gripping it tightly as I willed myself to drift off. The next morning, I resolved to find out more about what had happened that night. The man hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He had to live somewhere, know someone, have a past that could explain his actions. I started by scouring local news reports, searching for any mention of suspicious individuals or criminal activity in the area. But there was nothing, no reports, no warnings, not even a vague rumor. Frustrated, I turned to social media. I posted in a local neighborhood group, describing the man in vague terms and asking if anyone had seen him. The responses were mixed. Some people sympathized, sharing their own encounters with strangers who had made them feel uneasy. Others dismissed it as paranoia, suggesting I had misread the situation. A few even joked about it, their laughter evident in the emojis they left behind. But one comment stood out. It was from an older woman named Helen, who lived a few blocks away. "Your description reminds me of something that happened years ago," she wrote. "There was a man who used to wander this area at night, always dressed in dark clothes. People said he was harmless, just a drifter. But there were stories, weird stories. I'd be happy to tell you more if you're interested." I messaged her immediately, and we arranged to meet at a nearby cafe. Helen was kind, but there was a seriousness in her demeanor that unnerved me. Over cups of coffee, she told me about the drifter who had roamed the neighborhood years ago. He was an enigma, always appearing and disappearing without a trace. Some people claimed he was just a lost soul, a man down on his luck. Others believed he was something more sinister. There was a rumor, Helen said, lowering her voice. People said he would follow certain individuals, always at night. No one ever figured out why. Some thought he was looking for someone specific, others believed he was feeding off their fear. Feeding off their fear? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. I know it sounds ridiculous, but the people he followed, they always described feeling this overwhelming dread, like he wasn't just a man but something else. And then, one day, he stopped appearing. No one knows what happened to him. Maybe he moved on. Maybe something caught up with him. Helen's words stayed with me long after we parted ways. I wanted to dismiss them as the ramblings of an imaginative mind, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth to her story. That night, as I lay in bed clutching my knife, I realized something. The fear I felt wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what might still be out there, waiting in the shadows. The following week, I became consumed with the idea of finding answers. The man who followed me wasn't just a figment of my imagination or some random stranger, at least, I didn't think so. Something about him felt deliberate, calculated, and now Helen's words about the drifter had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Who was he? Was he connected to the stories Helen had heard, or was he someone new? I started altering my routine again, but this time it wasn't out of fear, it was to observe. I went on walks during different hours, carrying my knife and staying closer to populated areas. I wanted to see if he'd reappear. I even retraced the path I'd taken that night, hoping for some clue I might have missed. The paranoia hadn't left me, but now it was mixed with determination. For days, nothing happened. I began to wonder if I was chasing shadows, letting my imagination get the best of me. But then, one evening, just as I was about to give up, I saw him again. It was just past 6 p.m., and the streets were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. I was walking near a park when I caught sight of a figure in a dark hoodie standing beneath the tree. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his face obscured by the shadows. My heart started pounding as I slowed my pace, trying to get a better look without drawing attention to myself. It was him. I was sure of it. This time, I didn't run. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. Instead, I kept walking, pulling my phone out of my pocket and texting my dad. He's here. The same guy. I'm at the park near Elm Street. My dad's reply was immediate, stay where you are. I'll be there in 5 minutes. I glanced back over my shoulder. The man was still standing under the tree, but now his head was tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I kept walking, my steps steady but my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he back? The sound of an engine broke through the silence, and I turned to see my dad's car pulling up to the curb. I didn't wait for him to get out. I jogged over, opened the door, and got in. He's over there, I said, pointing toward the tree. My dad's expression hardened. Stay here, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped out of the car and started walking toward the man. I watched from the passenger seat, my heart in my throat. As my dad approached, the man finally moved. He turned and began walking away, his pace unhurried but purposeful. My dad called out to him, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he disappeared into the shadows, melting into the darkness as if he'd never been there at all. When my dad returned to the car, his jaw was set, his frustration evident. He's gone, he said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But if I see him again, he didn't finish the sentence, but I could hear the anger in his voice. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The way he'd stood there, unmoving. the way he'd vanished so easily. It was as if he'd wanted to be seen, but only on his terms. What was his endgame? The next morning, I decided to visit Helen again. I needed more information, more context for what was happening. She greeted me warmly but seemed concerned when I told her about the latest encounter. "It sounds like him," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Or someone like him. Did he follow you again?" I shook my head. "Not this time. He just watched." But it felt deliberate. Like he was waiting for something. Helen's expression darkened. "You need to be careful. If it is him or whatever he is, he doesn't just follow people randomly. There's always a reason. You need to figure out what he wants before it's too late." Her words unsettled me, but they also sparked a new determination. I wasn't going to let this man, this entity, control my life. If he wanted something, I would find out what it was. And if he came for me again, I'd be ready. Days turned into weeks, and I saw no sign of the man. I hoped, foolishly, perhaps, that he had given up, that whatever had drawn him to me was gone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The kind of fear he inspired didn't just fade. It lingered, embedding itself into the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Helen's words haunted me. "You need to figure out what he wants." But how? He wasn't some ordinary stalker I could reason with or report to the police. No, there was something far more sinister about him. Something that defied explanation. Then, one night, the silence broke. It was just after midnight, and I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from the direction of the front door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe a branch swaying in the wind, or a stray animal. But then it came again. Louder. More insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding. Grabbing the knife I kept on my nightstand, I crept toward the front door. The house was eerily quiet, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Taking a deep breath, I peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. My stomach churned with unease as I slowly unlocked the door and opened it just enough to peer outside. The street was deserted, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But something caught my eye, a piece of paper, folded neatly, resting on the doormat. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. Scrawled across the page in jagged, almost frantic handwriting were the words. "You can't run forever." My blood ran cold. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and double-checked every window in the house. The note confirmed what I had feared all along. He wasn't gone. He was waiting, watching, biding his time. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room with the knife in one hand and my phone in the other, ready to call my dad or the police at the first sign of trouble. But the hours dragged on, and nothing happened. By morning, I was exhausted but resolute. I couldn't live like this anymore. If he wanted to play games, I'd play too. But I'd do it on my terms. Over the next few days, I prepared. I installed security cameras around the house, changed my locks, and started carrying pepper spray in addition to my knife. I also made a point of talking to Helen again, hoping she might have some insight. When I showed her the note, her face paled. "This isn't random," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's targeting you. You need to figure out why." "How?" I asked, frustration seeping into my tone. "It's not like I can just ask him." Helen hesitated, then said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Maybe you don't have to. Sometimes, the answers aren't in the present. They're in the past." Her words stuck with me as I tried to piece together what she meant. Was there something in my past that could explain this? Some event or decision that had marked me in a way I didn't understand? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't have a clear answer. Then, one evening, it hit me. Something I had almost forgotten about. Years ago, when I was a teenager, my friends and I had dabbled in something we shouldn't have. It was a stupid, reckless thing, a so-called ritual we had found online, designed to summon something. At the time, we had laughed it off as a joke. Nothing had happened, or so we thought. Could that be connected? It seemed absurd, but the more I thought about it, the more plausible it felt. What if the ritual had worked, but not in the way we expected? What if we had called something into our world, and now, years later, it had found me? Desperate for answers, I reached out to one of my old friends who had been part of the ritual. When I brought it up, she went quiet. You remember that?" she finally said. "I've tried to forget." "Why?" I pressed. "Because weird things started happening after that," she admitted. "Not right away, but months later. I thought it was just coincidence, but now, I don't know." She went on to tell me about a series of unsettling experiences she had had over the years, strange figures watching her from a distance, unexplainable noises in the night, and a constant feeling of being followed. She had moved several times, trying to escape it, but the feeling always returned. Her story only confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This wasn't just about me. It was bigger than that. And if the ritual was the cause, then I needed to find a way to undo it. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research. I scoured books, online forums, and even reached out to people who claimed to be experts in the paranormal. Most of it was useless, contradictory advice and fear-mongering. But eventually, I found something that seemed promising. A counter-ritual, designed to banish whatever had been summoned. The instructions were specific and required certain items that weren't easy to find. But I was determined. I gathered everything I needed and waited for the next full moon, as the ritual demanded. When the night came, I followed the instructions to the letter. I performed the ritual in my backyard, the air thick with tension. As I finished the final step, a sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, extinguishing the candles I had lit. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I felt it, a presence. It was as if the air around me had become heavier, charged with something unseen. And then it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the night returned to its normal stillness. In the weeks that followed, I saw no sign of the man. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, and the notes stopped. It was as if he had never existed. But deep down, I knew better. He had existed, and he had been after me for a reason. Whether the ritual had truly banished him or simply driven him away, I couldn't say. All I knew was that, for now, I was free. But some nights, when the wind is just right and the shadows stretch long, I still feel like I'm being watched. And I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return.